This is Eleanor Patterson, 66, a mother and a widow, the quiet heart of this house. She stitched double shifts at the textile mill into these walls, sold her jewelry piece by piece to keep the lights on, and raised her son here with steady courage. Tonight the rooms glow with Christmas warmth, yet a thin worry edges her smile, because where she sees memories, others see property. She stands dignified, steady, unafraid. And now, hear her story from her.
A Christmas to Remember. Full narrative script, NTHE, smell of roasted turkey, filled every corner of my home that Christmas Eve, mixing with the sweet scent of cinnamon candles and pine needles from the tree my late husband and I had always placed by the front window. I stood in my kitchen, smoothing my apron with hands that had worked for 66 years, watching the golden light from the chandelier dance across the dining room table I had set with such care. This house, our house, had never looked more beautiful, wrapped in the warmth of family gathering and the promise of joy. NBUT, even as I smiled at the sound of laughter echoing from the living room, something cold twisted in my stomach. Perhaps it was the way my daughter-in-law Jessica had walked through my home earlier that day, her eyes lingering too long on the antique furniture, the oil paintings my husband had saved for months to buy me, the crystal vases that caught the afternoon light just so. She moved through my sanctuary like someone already measuring it for new curtains. NMY son David sat in his father's favorite armchair, his shoulders tense beneath his Christmas sweater, while Jessica perched on the sofa arm beside him, her manicured fingers drumming against the leather. She had been unusually quiet during dinner preparations, offering only polite smiles when our relatives asked about their plans for the new year. But I caught her whispering to David in corners, saw the way his face darkened whenever she pulled him aside, and I told myself I was imagining things. After all, this was Christmas Eve in the home I had built with my beloved husband Robert, the house where David had taken his first steps, where we had celebrated every milestone of our family's life. The walls held 40 years of memories, and tonight they would hold one more. I arranged the final touches on the dessert table, my grandmother's lace tablecloth catching the light, and felt that familiar surge of pride. This was my legacy, my gift to the family. I had sacrificed everything to nurture, yet as I watched Jessica's reflection in the dining room mirror, noting how her gaze swept across the room with something that looked disturbingly like ownership, my heart began to race with a dread I couldn't name. I didn't know that by dessert, my heart would break in front of everyone. Looking back now, I should have recognized the signs much earlier. But a mother's love has a way of blinding us to truths we're not ready to face. This house wasn't just wood and stone to me. It was the physical manifestation of every sacrifice I had ever made, every dream Robert and I had shared, every sleepless night I had endured to make it ours. I remember the early days so clearly, when Robert and I were young and foolish enough to believe that love alone could build a foundation. We had scraped together every penny for the down payment, working double shifts at the textile factory, where the air hung thick with cotton dust and the machinery roared from dawn until dusk. My fingers had bled from the needlework, my back had ached from bending over looms for 16 hours at a stretch, but every dollar we earned brought us closer to this dream. When Robert passed away 15 years ago, leaving me alone with teenage David, I thought my world had crumbled. The mortgage payments stretched before me like an impossible mountain, and there were nights I sat at this very kitchen table, surrounded by bills, and wondering if I would lose everything we had built together. I sold my wedding jewelry piece by piece, first the diamond earrings Robert had given me for our 10th anniversary, then the pearl necklace that had been my mother's, finally even my engagement ring, keeping only the simple gold band that symbolized our vows. And I ate crackers and tea for dinner, so David could have meat. I wore the same winter coat for 8 years, patching it until the patches needed patches. I took on extra shifts at the factory, cleaning offices at night after my regular job, my knees raw from scrubbing floors until they gleamed. Every sacrifice was an investment in this house, in David's future, in the stability I was determined to provide, and David had understood then, or so I believed. He would find me at the kitchen table with my calculator and bills, and he would wrap his teenage arms around my shoulders, promising he would never forget what I had done for him. "This house is our fortress, Mom," he used to say. Nothing will ever take it away from us. Those words had sustained me through the darkest nights, when the loneliness threatened to consume me and the weight of responsibility felt too heavy to bear. NNBUT lately, something had shifted. When I mentioned updating my will, or talked about the house's future, David's eyes would dart away, his jaw would tighten, and he would find excuses to leave the room. Jessica would smile that cool, calculating smile and change the subject with practiced ease. I told myself he was simply growing up, that married men had different priorities than teenage boys who promised their mothers the world. I thought my sacrifices had built a safe home, but cracks had already begun to show. NNTHE relatives began arriving just as the December sun was setting, painting the sky the color of old roses. I had spent the morning polishing every surface until it gleamed, arranging my grandmother's china on the mahogany table that Robert had surprised me with for our 20th anniversary. The silver candlesticks caught the light from the crystal chandelier, and the whole room sparkled like something from a magazine. My sister Margaret complimented the table setting, running her fingers along the edge of the lace tablecloth. "This house always feels like a palace at Christmas," she said, and I felt that familiar warmth of pride bloom in my chest. This was what I had worked for, moments when my family could gather in beauty and comfort, surrounded by the fruits of my labor. Jessica floated through the room in her designer dress, accepting compliments on her appearance while making small, cutting observations about the house. "The kitchen is so vintage," she said to my niece, her voice carrying just enough volume for me to hear from the doorway. "I keep telling David how much easier entertaining would be with a more modern layout. And of course, a house this size really needs younger ownership to maintain it properly." Each comment was like a small blade, carefully placed and precisely aimed. I watched my son's face as his wife spoke, noting the way his shoulders hunched, how he avoided meeting my eyes when I entered the room. The young man who had once promised to protect our fortress now sat silent, while his wife dismantled it piece by piece with words, and I chose to ignore the warning signs, telling myself that Jessica was nervous around the family, that her comments meant nothing more than a young woman's desire to make conversation. Love, I reasoned, would eventually silence whatever greed might be stirring in her heart. After all, this was my son, the boy I had raised alone, the man I had sacrificed everything to support, through college and into his career. Surely the bond between mother and child was stronger than whatever poison his wife might whisper in his ear. NNTHE evening progressed with the familiar rhythm of family gatherings, stories retold, laughter shared, glasses raised in celebration of another year together. I moved between kitchen and dining room, ensuring everyone's needs were met, basking in the warmth of seeing my home filled with the people I loved most. But when Jessica raised her glass for what I assumed would be a toast to the season, her words froze the entire room. "And I have an announcement," she said, her voice cutting through the chatter like a knife through silk. The conversation died instantly, all eyes turning to where she stood beside the fireplace, her champagne flute catching the light. "I know this might come as a surprise to some of you, but David and I have been making plans. Soon, this house will be mine." NNTHE words hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs and sending ice through my veins. Around the table, I could see my relatives, faces shifting from confusion to shock to horrified understanding. My sister Margaret's mouth fell open. My nephew set down his wine glass with a trembling hand, but it was the silence that followed, the terrible, suffocating silence, that told me everything I needed to know about how much my son had hidden from me. "David promised me this house months ago," Jessica continued, her voice bright with false cheer, as if she were discussing the weather rather than dismantling my entire world. "We've been talking about how much more comfortable his mother would be in a smaller place, something more suited to her age and limitations. Haven't we, darling?" I turned to look at my son, this man I had raised with every ounce of love in my body, waiting for him to speak up, to defend me, to tell his wife that she had misunderstood something crucial. But David sat frozen in his chair, his face pale as winter moonlight, his eyes fixed on his hands folded in his lap. The silence stretched between us like a chasm, and in that moment, I understood that my son, my baby, my life's work, had not only failed to defend me, but had actively plotted my exile from the home I had bled to build. NNTHE humiliation washed over me in waves, hot and suffocating. I could feel every eye in the room on me, could sense my family's discomfort as they witnessed my public destruction. Some looked away, unable to bear the sight of my shame. Others stared with the horrified fascination of witnesses to a car accident, but none of them spoke up. None of them challenged Jessica's claim or demanded that David explain himself. Jessica laughed then, a sound like breaking glass. "Of course, we'll make sure she's comfortable. There are some lovely senior communities not far from here. Much more appropriate for someone her age, don't you think? This house really needs a family that can appreciate its potential." NNTHE betrayal burned through me like acid, eating away at everything I had believed about love, about family, about the bonds that were supposed to be unbreakable between mother and child. But it was David's continued silence that pierced deeper than any of Jessica's words. Each second that passed without him speaking up was another nail in the coffin of our relationship, another confirmation that I had lost far more than my home that night. In that silence, I realized I had lost more than respect. I had lost my son, after the relatives left, some offering awkward hugs, others simply fleeing the scene of my humiliation. I retreated to my bedroom, my sanctuary within the sanctuary I was apparently destined to lose. I sat on the edge of the bed Robert and I had shared for 25 years, surrounded by the photographs that told the story of our life together. There was our wedding day, both of us so young and full of dreams. There was David as a baby, sleeping peacefully in this very room. There was Robert holding our toddler son, both of them grinning at the camera with identical smiles. And I picked up the largest photograph, the one I kept on my nightstand. Robert, on the day we had signed the deed to this house, his arm around my waist, both of us beaming with the pride of new homeowners. I could still hear his voice from that day, how he had pulled me close and whispered in my ear, "This home will always protect you, my love. No matter what happens, these walls will keep you safe." NNTHE. Tears came then, hot and bitter, mourning not just the loss of my home, but the death of the illusions I had carried about my son's love, about the security I thought I had built, about the promises I had believed would last forever. I had given David everything, my youth, my strength, my financial security, my unwavering devotion. And in return, he had given me silence when I needed his voice most. NBUT. As I sat there in the darkness, surrounded by the memories of better times, something began to shift inside me. The grief was transforming into something harder, more focused. I thought of Robert's promise, of the sacrifices I had made, of the blood and sweat that had gone into every brick of this house. I thought of Jessica's smug smile and David's cowardly silence, and I felt a fire begin to burn in my chest, a flame fueled by righteous anger and the fierce determination of a woman who had already survived too much to be destroyed by this. And I had not worked 16-hour days and eaten crackers for dinner, and sold my precious jewelry to build a legacy for my son's greedy wife. I had not sacrificed my youth and my health and my happiness to be discarded like an old piece of furniture when it became inconvenient to house me. If they wanted war, then they had chosen the wrong woman to challenge. NNTHE. Next morning dawned clear and cold, and I awoke with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. While David and Jessica slept late, recovering from their night of triumph, I dressed carefully and drove across town to visit Harold Brennan, Robert's old friend who had handled our legal affairs for decades. Harold listened to my story with growing outrage, his weathered face darkening as I recounted Jessica's announcement and David's betrayal. "And that house is yours, Eleanor," he said firmly, pulling out thick files that documented every aspect of my ownership. "Your name is on the deed, you've paid every cent of the mortgage, and no one, not your son, not his wife, not anyone, has any legal claim to it whatsoever. But we need to make sure it stays that way." Over the following weeks, I moved like a woman with a secret mission. I gathered documents, updated my will with ironclad provisions, and secured copies of every piece of paperwork that proved my sole ownership of the house. I consulted with financial advisors about protecting my assets, and spoke quietly with trusted neighbors about serving as witnesses if the need arose. Every step I took was careful, deliberate, and completely hidden from David and Jessica. During their visits, I played the part of the defeated old woman they expected to see. I listened without comment to Jessica's increasingly bold suggestions about my transition to senior living. I nodded politely when she brought brochures for retirement communities, even as my blood boiled at her presumption. I watched my son's face during these conversations, noting the flickers of guilt that crossed his features, the way his hands trembled slightly when his wife outlined their plans for our house. David seemed caught between two worlds, the world where he was his mother's devoted son, and the world where he was Jessica's compliant husband. I could see the war being waged behind his eyes, but his silence in my defense had already told me which side was winning. Still, I gathered evidence of their scheme, recording conversations and saving text messages, building a case that would expose their greed for what it was. When the time came, their greed would expose them, not me. NNTHE trap was finally sprung on a bright March afternoon, nearly 3 months after that devastating Christmas dinner. Jessica had arranged what she called a, quote, a family meeting, ostensibly to discuss my future arrangements. She had even gone so far as to prepare what she described as transfer documents that would, she claimed, ensure my financial security in my new living situation. NNTHE entire family was there again. Margaret, my nephew Tom, several cousins, all gathered around the same dining room table where Jessica had first announced her intentions. She had clearly expected this to be a formality, a simple matter of getting my signature on papers that would hand over everything I had worked for. Her confidence was palpable as she spread the documents across the mahogany surface, her voice honey-sweet as she explained how generous she and David were being in their care for my declining years. "We've found the perfect place for you, Mother Eleanor," she said, using the title that had always sounded false from her lips. "It's a lovely community with activities and medical care right on site. You'll be so much happier there, without the burden of maintaining such a large house." I let her finish her presentation, watching as she laid out her carefully crafted lies about my supposed incompetence and need for supervised care. I saw David squirm in his chair, his face flushed with shame, but his mouth still stubbornly shut. I allowed Jessica to hand me the pen to point to the signature lines with their false promises of security. Then I smiled. "How thoughtful of you to be so concerned about my welfare," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "But I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding." I reached into my purse and withdrew the thick manila envelope Harold had prepared for me. "You see, I've done some planning of my own." Jessica's confident smile wavered as I spread my own documents across the table. The deed showing my sole ownership, the mortgage papers proving I had paid every cent, the updated will that made my intentions crystal clear. But it was the presence of Harold himself, who entered the room at my signal, that made her face go completely white. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harold announced in his courtroom voice, "I'm here as Mrs. Eleanor Patterson's legal counsel to clarify a few matters regarding the ownership of this property." He gestured to the papers Jessica had brought. "What you've just witnessed is an attempted fraud, an effort to coerce my client into signing away property that belongs to her alone, through documents that have no legal standing whatsoever." NNTHE silence that followed was deafening. Jessica's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, while David's face went from shame red to panic white in the span of seconds. Around the table, my relatives stared in shock at the magnitude of the deception that had been attempted in their presence. "Nin, this house is mine," I said, my voice carrying the authority of absolute truth. "I bought it with my husband, I paid for it with my labor, and I have sacrificed everything to keep it. No one, not my son, not his wife, not anyone, will ever take it from me through lies and manipulation." I looked directly at Jessica, letting her see the steel in my eyes. "I will never be erased from my own home." David finally found his voice, stammering apologies that came far too late. "Mom, we never meant, it was just an idea, we weren't really going to." But his words dissolved into meaningless noise, the desperate backpedaling of a man who had been caught in an indefensible position. Jessica's confidence had crumbled entirely, replaced by the wild-eyed panic of someone whose carefully laid plans had just exploded in her face. But the true fallout had only just begun. In the days and weeks that followed Jessica's public humiliation, the consequences of her greed rippled through our family and community, like stones thrown into still water. Word spread quickly about what she had attempted, how she had tried to manipulate an elderly widow into signing away her home, how she had publicly announced her intention to displace me, how she had enlisted my own son in her scheme. NNTHE whispers started at the grocery store, where neighbors who had known me for decades approached with expressions of outrage and support. Margaret told me that Jessica could barely show her face at the country club anymore, that conversations stopped when she entered rooms, that former friends crossed streets to avoid her. The reputation she had worked so carefully to build, the image of herself as a sophisticated, caring daughter-in-law, had shattered completely, revealing the calculating opportunist underneath. David found himself caught in an impossible position, torn between a marriage built on his betrayal of his mother and the crushing weight of his own guilt. His colleagues at the law firm had heard about the incident. Harold had made sure of that, and his standing in the community plummeted as word spread about his treatment of the woman who had sacrificed everything to put him through law school. He visited me several times, each encounter more painful than the last, his apologies hollow echoes of words that should have been spoken when they might have mattered. Meanwhile, I discovered something remarkable. I was growing stronger, not weaker, in the aftermath of their betrayal. The house that had briefly felt like a burden became my fortress again, filled with the certainty that I had fought for it, and won. I no longer waited anxiously for David's approval or Jessica's acceptance. I no longer measured my worth by their treatment of me. The dignity I had nearly lost that Christmas night had been restored, not through their grace, but through my own fierce determination to protect what was mine. NNTHE silence that had once meant rejection now meant peace. I had learned to command respect rather than beg for love, and the difference was transformative. And so, at last, the house was mine again, not just in deed, but in spirit. Spring arrived with unusual warmth that year, and I found myself spending more time in the garden Robert and I had planted together 40 years ago. The daffodils he had surprised me with for our first anniversary were blooming again. Bright yellow faces turned toward the sun. The apple tree we had planted when David was born was heavy with blossoms, promising fruit that I would enjoy alone if necessary. I had made my peace with the possibility that my son might choose his wife's ambitions over his mother's love. The relationship we had shared, or that I thought we had shared, might be damaged beyond repair. But I had also discovered that my worth was not dependent on his recognition, that my legacy was not diminished by his betrayal. The house stood solid around me, every room a testament to the strength I had found within myself when I needed it most. This was not just a building of brick and mortar. It was the physical manifestation of my survival, the monument to Robert's memory, the proof that a woman's determination could overcome any obstacle. Every sacrifice I had made, every hardship I had endured, every tear I had shed, had been an investment in something larger than myself, a legacy of resilience that no one could steal or diminish. As I sat in my garden that evening, watching the sun set through the leaves of our apple tree, I reflected on the price of silence and the value of speaking truth. I thought about David's choice to remain quiet when his voice could have protected me, about the courage it takes to stand up for what is right even when it costs us something precious. I understood now that love without honor is hollow, that loyalty without backbone is meaningless. NNTHE house would outlive me, as it had outlived Robert, carrying forward the story of our struggles and our triumphs. But it would do so on my terms, protected by my choices, secured by my refusal to be diminished by others. Greed. In the end, I had learned the most important lesson of all. A house is not given, it is earned, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice.